welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life. Not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show on iTunes, or use our RSS feed with your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter, Instagram, and SoundCloud at vmspod, at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave us a rating and review. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/vmspod and set up your level of support. Every week you'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. It's the last episode of the year. Since the calendar fell just right, we're going to close out 2017 with our 5th annual guest list episode. The guest list is when I ask the past year's Virtual Memories podcast guest to tell us about the favorite book they read in the past year. Doesn't have to be something published in 2017, just something they read and loved. Some of them also told me about which books or authors they're hoping to tackle in 2018. We got responses from 36 guests, which is a pretty good count. I don't give too much of an intro to any of them during this episode, so I hope you'll look up the roster in our archives or on iTunes, because all of their episodes are listed there, and these guys all are pretty fascinating creators, writers, artists, cartoonists, etc. Plus, if you go to chimeraobscura.com/vm or vmspod.com, you'll find a link to the guest list 2017. And that has links to all of the books mentioned in this episode, as well as links to each guest's particular episode. And if you're interested in my favorite reads from the past year and my maybe goals for 2018, I'll tell you those at the end of the episode, okay? Now let's get started. Matt Worker writes, sadly/funnily enough, I just finished reading Al Franken's charming Giant of the Senate. He comes across as such a nice straight talker who could have had a great career in Washington. As for reading in 2018, I'm feeling that the times call for a return to Vonnegut. So I just got Cat's Cradle off the shelf, and that way I'll be ready for whatever comes at us in the new year, Ice 9 or whatever. You can check out Matt's political cartoons every week at Politico. Now, Eddy Portnoy writes, Busy Dying by Hilton, not that he's busy dying. The book he suggested from 2017 is Busy Dying by Hilton Obenzinger, which is a wonderfully written memoir of events at Columbia University in 1968. Highly recommended. For 2018, anything by the artist Blex Bolex. Eddy's new book is Bad Rabbi and Other Strange But True Tales from the Yiddish Press, which is included in my list of great books from 2017. The cartoonist and tattoo artist Graham Chaffee writes, I'm not listing comics because there's way too many. But one, A Manual for Cleaning Women by Lucia Berlin, just fantastic short fiction. And two, Jussi Adler-Olsen, a Scandinavian mystery writer recommended to me recently. Graham's newest graphic novel is To Have and to Hold from Fantagraphics. And next time I'm out in L.A., he promises to do some work to cover over the tattoo that I've got. Now, R.O. Blechman writes, I recently read the book of a favorite artist of mine and was delighted to learn that she writes as engagingly as she draws. The artist is Tamara Shopson. The book, Arbitrary Stupid Goal. A romp so welcome these days and perfect for the holidays. I also enjoyed Alan Bennett's 6 Poets, a discussion of 6 English poets from Thomas Hardy to Philip Larkin, with several works of each included. If you know Bennett's writing, then you'll know that he never disappoints. And what a pleasure it is to read poetry that's meant to be understood. So rare these days. And I should know, I illustrate contemporary poems on a mostly weekly basis for the New York Times, and they're invariably head-scratchers. There are no head-scratchers in this book. As for a book I'd like to read next year, well, can you believe I've never read Jane Austen? So will I? I'll let you know next year. R.O. Blechman's illustrations, as you pointed out, can be found almost every week in the New York Times. Editor and publisher Gordon Van Gelder writes, "You caught me in a good year. There have been too many years where I've struggled to name 2 books I really liked. This year, I have to pare the list down. 1, The Night Ocean by Paul Lafarge, my favorite novel of the year. It digs into the lives, both real and imagined, of the Futurians, of Lovecraft and his circle, and more. And if I were you, I'd get Paul on your radar for a future guest on Virtual Memories," Gordon writes. 2, Apollo 8 by Jeffrey Kluger. I thought I would just skim this book, but I wound up getting caught up in it. The level of detail is just perfect, and the book has new information, like the actual cause of the fire that killed Grissom, Chaffee, and White. I was going to add a work of erotica, Constaint, by my friend Siri Ustal, but it turns out I read that one in 2016. I did read Don Westlake's A Likely Story on a flight in 2017, and I think I scared the guy sitting next to me with my outbursts of laughter. Also, I've got to mention Karen Fowler's We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves. I read half or 2/3 a couple of years ago when it first came out, and then I lent my copy to someone. I finished it this year, and the ending really knocked me out. Gordon writes, for 2018, there's some book about a crow by some guy named Aleister Crowley who was on your show. Also, my local thrift shop had some cheap Easton Press editions recently, and I picked up a few classics I hope to read in the coming months. Vying for the top spot are The Origin of Species and Ethan Frome. An unlikely pair, I admit. I'll also say that the Philip K. Dick Award ballot for this year is looking very good, but you'll have to wait until January to find out what's on it. Turns out, Gordon meant John Crowley, not Aleister Crowley. I think he was making a joke. His new novel, Ka, shows up on a few other guests' lists, and mine. Like Liz Hand, who writes, "My favorite novel was John Crowley's new novel, Ka, which follows the adventures of an immortal crow whose myriad lifetimes dovetail with those of various humans, from Neolithic Northern Europe to near-future America. It's a beautiful, haunting meditation on the emergence of human consciousness, on death, the afterlife, and our increasingly tenuous relationship with the natural world. Crowley is a brilliant writer, and this is one of his very finest novels." As for a book or author I hope to read, Liz writes, I tend to rely on whim and serendipity to guide me in my choice of reading, so whatever high hopes I have for tackling, say, Anna Karenina, will almost certainly be dashed because I will get immersed in a new novel by someone I never previously heard of, like Elmet by Fiona Mosley, or Andrew Michael Hurley's The Lonely. The Loney. But I'm also a sucker for anything about rock and roll, so I'm looking forward to Uncommon People, The Rise and Fall of the Rock Stars by David Hepworth. Oh, and also Anna Karenina. Liz's new book is Hard Light, another novel in her Cass Neary series. And John Crowley himself writes, for 2017, Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. Of course, no one in the posh papers would say so, but it's a ghost story, with some fairly traditional ghosts in it. The rest, though, is all Saunders, entirely original and deeply moving. For 2018, well, I recently learned that W.S. Merwin translated the Purgatorio. Because of an odd conjunction with the third book of my Egypt series and a piece by Borges, I thought I might write about it. I have to read it first, though. As mentioned, John's new book, Ka, is fantastic, and that's spelled K-A. Shannon Wheeler writes, My favorite thing is Monsters is recent to my memory, and it deserves a favorite spot as much as anything else. There was a giant slew of great books this year that came by me. In 2018, I plan to read more Orwell. Also, I'm enjoying The Expanse. I think the new book, Persepolis Rising, comes out soon. I'm excited to read it. Shannon's new book is Shit My President Says, The Illustrated Tweets of Donald J. Trump, from Top Shelf Productions. Michael Meyer writes, The best book I've read this year is The World Broke in Two, Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, E.M. Forster, and the Year That Changed Literature by Bill Goldstein. That inelegant, keyword-heavy subtitle notwithstanding, this page-turning piece of literary archival reportage takes readers through the year 1922, when London was still shell-shocked from the Great War, and each of the four authors was at their lowest point of his or her career, struggling with family, finances, mental illness, and artistic frustration, the latter condition exacerbated by the publication of Ulysses. Yet by year's end, each had finished a masterpiece. It's compelling, heartbreaking, and uplifting all at once. Michael's new book is The Road to Sleeping Dragon, Learning China from the Ground Up, from Bloomsbury, USA. Paul Gravett writes, "Hello from Busan on the sunny southeastern coast of South Korea, where I've been invited to the Busan Global Webtoon Center for their first Webtoon Festival. Is the future of comics virtual and vertical on your smartphone?" Meanwhile, among the printed paper English-language books I most enjoyed reading in 2017 were the deliciously understated and very English graphic novel Driving Short Distances by Joff Winterhart, the bande dessinée Portugal by Cyril Pedrosa, which is radiant with saudade, or saudade, I guess, if you're Portuguese, or Brazilian, and the evocative Silk Road period manga A Bride's Story by Kaoru Mori. And the book I'm most looking forward to reading in 2018 is Tumult by John Harris Dunning and Michael Kennedy, due from Self-Made Hero. From what I've seen already, this is a gripping tale of twisted passions and marks a stunning graphic novel debut of British artist Kennedy. Paul's new book, Mangasia, The Definitive Guide to Asian Comics, accompanies his massive art exhibition, currently in Rome. Wallis Wilde-Menozzi writes, "I propose the work of two authors, both of whom write in all genres. This quality makes them very much a part of our century. It's a century where the truth of narrative is no longer a single one, nor seen from a single angle. Writing in different genres, coming from one mind, lets us see the world that the author sees, as an approximation of reality that fluctuates and changes depending on the objectives of the point of view. I recently read 3 books written by Julian Barnes: The Noise of Time, a novel about Shostakovich, The Sense of an Ending, a book of nonfiction about Barnes's wife's death and his life after it, and Keeping an Eye Open, a book of very personal essays about various painters and artists in different centuries. In all 3 books, we are accompanied by Barnes's fine sense of detail and distinction. We get a sense of his way of interpreting life and art, seen from different perspectives. He is brilliant without blinding us with it. He is full of feelings and conveys them with restraint and quiet clarity. Anne Carson is a poet and translator and essayist. I recommend Autobiography of Red, a novel in verse, based in part on the Greek author Stesichorus' plot. Glass, irony, God, personal essays, float, a pack of pieces, most under 20 pages that can be read separately and in any order. Her mind is an iconoclastic one, and her intelligence is startling, sharp, and steely. She is often original and uses language as only a poet can. She creates reality that perhaps doesn't exist, by putting it into words. For next year, Wallis writes, I hope to reread The Confessions of St. Augustine. Wallis is the author of several books, favorite of which for me is The Other Side of the Tiber, Reflections on Time in Italy, from Farrar Straus-Giroux. Nicholas Delbanco writes, To my mind, Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders is a truly original book and one I greatly savored. And in order to remain in that period, when the men in power were honorable and complex, I much look forward to reading Ron Chernow's biography, Grant. The president and his general 150 years ago put our present practitioners to shame. Nicholas's new essay is Curiouser and Curiouser from Mad Creek Books. And Telnaes just sent me a picture of the cover of The Soul of the First Amendment by Floyd Abrams, with no comment. You can find Anne's political cartoons in the Washington Post and through her Twitter feed. Telnaes is Telnaes. And when you check out her stuff, you'll realize why The Soul of the First Amendment is probably her pivotal book for the year. Now, the illustrator John Cuneo writes, Who is Rich? By Matthew Clam. It's about an illustrator and sex and marriage, also suicide, professional envy, and self-loathing. Strangely enough, I found it relatable. It was recently voted one of the 100 notable books of the year by the New York Times Book Review, and it includes a handful of drawings that are reproduced too small and that I wish I could go back and do over. It's recommended for its searingly honest and self-lacerating voice. All My Puny Sorrows by Miriam Toews is so beautiful, sad, and funny that it somehow penetrated my fortified exoskeleton of misanthropy and made me want to cry and hug the world. Also, Lit, a memoir by Mary Carr, this one about her alcoholism and spiritual recovery. It's one of a pile of quote-unquote drinking memoirs I've reread recently, John writes. I myself was drinking hard the first time around and, of course, recall very little. So it's been nice to revisit and relate, but from a slightly more tranquil distance. You can find John's illustrations in lots of magazines, and you can check out his sketchbooks and videos at Instagram at Cuneo3, and that's C-U-N-E-O and the number 3. Kyle Cassidy writes, I was really blown away by Alexandra de Stigor's book Isles of Shoals. She spent the last 20 winters on an abandoned island off the coast of Maine as the caretaker for a vacant hotel. It's like The Shining, but with seascapes. I ended up sending her a fan letter and emailing back and forth about photography. I also loved Robert Herman's The Phone Book, which is a series of really beautiful photos he took with his phone. I love that one because while I'm traveling, I'm usually taking photos with my phone. I, quote-unquote, read Ross Haflin's book The Ultimate Metallica, which I took out of the library using the Hula app on my iPad. Oleg Tolstoy's portrait book, The Tolstoys in the 21st Century, and Ken Brower and Deborah Ory's photo book of dancers, The Art of Movement, were both really great portrait books, and I followed Gregory Crudzen's Cathedral of the Pines on Twitter while they were shooting it. As far as fiction books, I got stranded in Chicago during a snowstorm, and, oddly enough, my publicist at Hachette had given me a copy of a book by another one of their authors, Sarah Dunn's The Arrangement, which is about a middle-aged couple's middle-aged couple problems. It was sad and funny and touching, and I've not enjoyed being snowed in so much in my life since I was 12. That book really knocked me out. It was beautiful, and I didn't want the snow to end. I finished it about 10 minutes before my plane eventually landed, and the entire time I was transported. Kyle's new book is This is What a Librarian Looks Like, a celebration of libraries, communities, and access to information, published by Black Dog and Leventhal. Cullen Murphy simply writes, 2017, Cuz, by Danielle Allen, and that's C-U-Z. 2018, Stalin, Waiting for Hitler, by Stephen Kotkin. Cullen's new book is Cartoon County, My Father and His Friends in the Golden Age of Make-Believe, from FSG. Vanessa Sinclair writes, I've read an interesting variety of books this year, but the ones that stand out are Ta-Nehisi Coates' We Were 8 Years in Power and J.G. Ballard's Hello, America, as an interesting and powerful combination. The upcoming short list of books I plan to read next includes Violent Borders by Rhys Jones, Ian Kershaw's To Hell and Back, Joan Didion Play It As It Lays, and Juliet Flower McCannell's The Hysterics Guide to the Future Female Subject, all chosen as fodder and inspiration for my own writing. Vanessa's new book of cut-up poetry is Switching Mirrors, from Trap Art. The illustrator Joe Ciardiello writes Black Elk by Joe Jackson and My Favorite Thing is Monsters by Emil Ferris. No book goals for 2018 other than my own, which is something I am really looking forward to, especially after seeing Joe's Spaghetti Journal exhibition at the Hunterdon Art Museum this past fall. Sarah Williams Goldhagen, who's in the midst of a trip around the world, writes from Melbourne, Australia, Of the books I've read this past year, 2 stand out. In fiction, Julia Glass's A House Under the Trees, which I just finished. In addition to delightfully humane characters, it's a tribute to imagination and creativity, and lives well lived. And it conveys a centrality of place just brilliantly. In nonfiction, Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is a revelatory analysis of why Europe and China developed modern civilization so much earlier than other places in the world. It's the best example of argumentation and clear analysis that I've read since Danny's last book. Danny being her husband, Daniel Goldhagen, also a past guest of the show. Sarah's new book is Welcome to Your World, How the Built Environment Shapes Our Lives, from Harper. Vanda Krefft writes, My favorite books read in 2017 were Stoner by John Williams and 2 Evelyn Waugh books, The Loved One and A Handful of Dust. In 2018, I hope to tackle War and Peace by Tolstoy at long last. Vanda's new book is The Man Who Made the Movies, The Meteoric Rise and Tragic Fall of William Fox, from Harper. It's about Anna Karenina length, not War and Peace length, but I promise it's a very, very fast read. John Clute writes, "It's hard to remember when a book is read. John Crowley's Ka is easy as it was only published this year. At the beginning of 2017, I was reading Kazuo Ishiguro, The Remains of the Day, The Unconsoled, When We Were Orphans, Never Let Me Go. I had already read The Buried Giant to review it back in 2016. Still, it made the Nobel surprise a very happy one. Don DeLillo's White Noise was also utterly gorgeous. In 2018, I may properly tackle James Lee Burke, having read several Dave Robichaux novels over the past few years. Now I may give the whole series, till I flag, a chance to prove it is the great American roman fleuve, or not. The new installment, Robichaux, is out in a few weeks, and it sounds as though it may be Terminus, though it is told in the first person. But Robichaux more or less ages in real time, not as rigorously perhaps as Jack Reacher, and should be at least as old as I am, and this may be his quietus, so maybe time to take a run. You can check out John's work online at the Science Fiction Encyclopedia. Matt Ruff writes, "My two favorite books of 2017 were The Night Ocean by Paul Lafarge and The Fact of a Body by Alexandria Marzano-Lesnevich. The Night Ocean takes its title from a short story co-authored by H.P. Lovecraft and his young fan Robert Barlow. Lovecraft spent several months visiting Barlow at his home in Florida while Barlow was still a teenager, and, inevitably, there's been speculation about what exactly went on between them. In Lafarge's novel, a journalist named Charlie Willett develops an unhealthy obsession with the Lovecraft-Barlow relationship that lands him in a mental hospital. After Charlie apparently commits suicide by drowning himself in a lake, his estranged wife, Marina, begins her own search for answers. Which might sound like the premise of a Lovecraftian horror story, but The Night Ocean is something stranger and more wonderful than that. It's a meditation on the power of storytelling. It jumps back and forth in time and pulls in a diverse cast of real-life characters. William S. Burroughs, Roy Cohn, and a young Ursula K. Le Guin all make appearances. It's one of those novels that keeps you constantly guessing about what game the author is playing. Every time you think you've finally got it figured out, Lafarge yanks the rug out from under you again. Unfortunately, the same qualities which make The Night Ocean such a joy to read make it difficult to describe or pitch to an audience. So, despite being brilliant, I don't think it's gotten nearly the attention it deserves, but you shouldn't miss it. The Fact of a Body is a true crime story about Ricky Langley, a convicted pedophile and child murderer. The author, Alexandria Marzano-Lesnevich, was an intern at a law firm that defended Langley, and she had her own very personal reason for being interested in his case. The book combines an examination of Langley's crimes with a memoir of how Marzano-Lesnevich and her sisters were molested by their own grandfather. It's gripping and insightful, and while I know some readers will be wary of the subject matter, Marzano-Lesnevich handles it all with great sensitivity, so it never turns lurid. It's one of the best works of nonfiction I've read in a long time. Now, as for what I want to read in 2018, for a while now I've had my eye on a book called Mnemonica by the Spanish magician Juan Tamariz. The book describes a technique for taking a factory-sealed deck of playing cards and using a precise series of cuts and shuffles to put it into a seemingly random order, an order which, in fact, the magician has memorized. Basically, it's a stacked deck that doesn't look stacked, and after a few thousand hours of practice, you can do amazing tricks with it. English copies of Mnemonica are pricey and hard to come by, but I think I'm going to track one down this Christmas. I doubt I have the dexterity or patience to learn Tamariz's method, but it seems like it'd be a cool thing to own, and I'm sure I'll get a story idea out of it. Matt's most recent book is Lovecraft Country, from Harper Perennial. Sven Birkerts writes, I took the most reading pleasure this year from Teju Cole's Known and Strange Things, a rereading of Joseph Roth's Radetzky March, Rachel Cusk's Transit, and assorted late-night meditations over W.G. Sebald. I'm looking forward to James Wood's novel next year, and that's James Wood, not James Woods, and I'm at that stage in my reading life where I will scan my own shelves and think, ooh, I have to go back to that. Is there a new Javier Marias? book coming, I would jump on that too. There is. It's called Between Eternities, and it ought to be out next summer. Sven's most recent book is Changing the Subject, Art and Attention in the Internet Age, from Grey Wolf Press, and I enjoyed the living heck out of that one. Barbara Epler, the publisher at New Directions, writes, I'm going to root for our own books, and, given everything, all the books are by women. From 2017, my favorites are Rachel Ingalls' Mrs. Caliban, a slender knockout novel about an unhappy housewife who finds romance with an escaped 7-foot-tall sea monster who, though green and aquatic, turns out to be a curious, avocado-eating, tender lover. These Possible Lives and I Am the Brother of XX, extraordinary unforgettable essays and stories by Fleur Jaeggy, and that's Jaegggy. Remember, go to the show notes page. You'll find all of these books, their authors, and links to them everywhere. So an odd, off-kilter tenderness animates these strange, beautiful, dry ice works. With Jaeggy, as Brodsky said, remembering time is the rest of your life. Debths, Debths, Susan Howe's newest poetry collection. It explores memory, its threads and galaxies. Quote, the mystery of strong music in the soul. There is no one like her, and in her, quote, not being in the know, she says yes to setting poetry wantonly, exhilaratingly free. Forthcoming in 2018, don't miss Yoko Tawada's The Emissary, set in a post-Fukushima Japan where babies are born ancient and feeble, but happy. Clarice Lispector's extraordinary second novel, never before in English, The Chandelier, about a young woman freeing herself and her creativity. 13 delicious, deeply funny stories by Helen DeWitt in the collection Some Trick, and the American debut of the amazing Jamaican novelist Marcia Douglas, The Marvelous Equations of the Dread, a time-tripping, hallucinatory Rasta novel in bass rhythm. Now, Martin Rowson writes, apologies, I'm just trying to remember what the hell I've read this year, but here's a stab. These days I consume most of my lit orally, and that's A-U-R-A-L-L-Y, with the wonders of the audiobook which I can consume while drawing. That's how I finally got round to Anthony Pohl's Dance to the Music of Time, which was much better than I'd always prejudiciously imagined it would be. I suppose I thought it would be an indigestible mixture of C.P. Snow and P.G. Wodehouse, neither of whom I can stomach for long. Nice to be disabused. As to reading, I reckon the book I enjoyed the most was one I've read and reread every 10 years or so since I was about 11. It's a truly weird yet wonderful book called Let's Kill Uncle by Rohan O'Grady, the nom de plume of Canadian writer June Skinner. That this is one of Donna Tartt's favorite books, and the first edition had a frontispiece by Edward Gorey, should be enough to whet anyone's appetite to read it for themselves. Also, for the record, I started reading it out loud to my dear friend and agent David Miller as he lay in a semi-coma after a catastrophic cardiac arrest on Christmas Eve last year. He never regained consciousness, and I never read him more than half the first chapter, so I finished it myself on a trip to India. Its combination of dark, cynical laughs and triumphant, innocent hope did just the trick, which is more or less why we have books in the first place. You can find Martin's political cartoons at The Guardian, among other places. Keiler Roberts writes, 2 books that I read recently were Family Life, published 2015, and A Life of Adventure and Delight in 2017, both by Akhil Sharma. Family Life is one of the most heartbreaking novels I've read. It's based on the author's life, and A Life of Adventure and Delight contains a short story with the same plot as his earlier published novel, A Family Life. I found it fascinating to read the same story told in 2 different ways. I also love Sarah Silverman's book, The Bedwetter, stories of courage, redemption, and pee. It was funny, sad, and surprising. My favorite comic of the year was Mimi Pond's The Customer is Always Wrong. I felt like I had been waiting for that story to exist, and I'll definitely read it again in 2018. Keiler's new book is Sunburning, from Koyama Press. And speaking of Mimi Pond, who was on the show twice this year, here she is now. Mimi writes, I really can't say enough good things about My Favorite Thing is Monsters by Emil Ferris. With the avalanche of graphic novels now out in the world, I would posit that 99.9% of them are works I have no interest in. My favorite thing is Monsters, on the other hand, is everything I want a graphic novel to be. Gorgeous drawing, fantastic story, brilliant narrative, and it leaves you wanting more. Guy Delisle's Hostage also fits in that same category, surprisingly gripping for a book about someone stuck in a dark room for months on end. The Price of Illusion, by former French Vogue editor Joan Juliette Buck, is a gripping memoir about growing up in the heady atmosphere of the 1960s and 70s London and Paris, with a glamorous, overreaching movie producer for a father, heading towards a career in fashion that eventually leads her down a hall of mirrors. Beautifully written and fascinating. This quote from her father about storytelling really went straight to my heart. "You can't capture reality. You have to shape it." I also finally tackled Washington Square by Henry James and found it riveting, beautifully written, and amazingly feminist in its tone. For 2018, I anxiously await the next volume of My Favorite Thing is Monsters. Mimi's new book, as mentioned, is The Customer is Always Wrong, from Drawn and Quarterly. Samuel Delany writes, Chubbs by Hugh Lemmy was entertaining and engaging. Probably that's a short novel that I enjoyed the most. It was self-published. Chubbs is Chubz, and Hugh Lemmy is Huwlemmey. Anyway, you can find it on Amazon. Joyce Farmer writes, 2017, I read Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique for the first time and was blown away by the research and breakthrough ideas she bravely put down on paper in 1963. Each chapter had important information which still reverberates today, especially regarding women's current relationship with the opposite sex. I find it a bit shameful that I never got around to this seminal book before. Books to tackle in 2018? Well, Scenes from the Life of Matthias Almosino by Isidoros Zorgos. This is a historical novel and it's written in Greek. I can read about 3 to 6 pages a day and have reached page 99. It's 700 pages long. Thus, the commitment for 2018. I'm not fluent in speaking Greek, but perhaps will become fluent in reading. This story is about the travels by a family of crypto-Jews from 1657 to 1710 or so. Very well written, with lots of everyday details and conversations regarding their place and risks in a plague-ridden, generally Christian Europe. One character believes his son is the Christian Messiah. The book may have been translated into German, but so far is not available in English. These choices have made me very happy during 2017, and Gil, thanks for providing a forum for all us weirdos. Joyce's most recent work was a 2010 release, Special Exits, from Fantagraphics. The editor Ellen Datlow writes, The Changeling by Victor Laval takes the reader for an emotionally wrenching roller coaster ride when a horrific act destroys a seemingly idyllic life of a couple and their infant. Nothing is as it seems. There's magic and horror and strange happenings and nasty people, and it's just terrific. As for my hoped reading in 2018, I hope to get to 2 nonfiction titles that came out in the last 2 years. I rarely read nonfiction. I bought Hillary Clinton's What Happened, in solidarity as much to read it, but I haven't had the time to actually do so with my fiction reading and editing deadlines. I hope I can find the time in 2018, along with Ruth Franklin's Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life. Ellen's most recent anthology, she's the editor, is Mad Hatters and March Hares, all new stories from the world of Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, from Tor Books. Michael Tisserand writes, My book of the year was Jonathan Eig's Ali, A Life. I place it beside Peter Guralnick's 2-volume biography of Elvis Presley as a stunning example of how to tell the story of an iconic figure in a way that celebrates a great life while revealing very human contradictions and failings. I, like others, grew up with Ali as a sports hero and a controversial political figure. In the last years of his life, I, like others, was moved by his participation in the Olympics in the face of his declining physical powers. Yet through Eig's extensive reporting and graceful prose, I was able to come as close to Ali as I'm ever likely to get. Eig's scenes of Ali's boxing bouts are both thrilling and heartbreaking, capturing the intensity and athleticism of the event while taking full stock of the brutal treatment the boxer's body received for our entertainment. 2 other books are notable for the audacity of their inventiveness. How to Read Nancy, The Elements of Comics in 3 Easy Panels by Paul Karasik and Mark Newgarden. It's a microscopic look at a single Nancy strip that with each turn of the lens reveals new worlds of language and meaning. And, in My Favorite Thing is Monsters, Emil Ferris has created a world of art and history and imagination and love that might look like a book, but really feels like a gift from the heart. A monster's heart, which is the best kind. Along with inducing panic for the health of our democracy, all this talk of Russia keeps reminding me that there are works of Russian literature I want to visit and revisit. So I plan on rereading Anton Chekhov, this time guided by George Saunders in the Chekhov-Saunders Humanity Kit that is on longreads.com, as well as, get ready for a true confession here, I will finally read Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov for the first time. Now, this is Gil here. This burns my ass because when I asked Michael Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, he cut me off and said Chekhov. And when I asked him to differentiate just those two, he once again said Chekhov. So the fact that he hasn't read The Brothers K but was already leaping to Chekhov as his greatest Russian writer, we have something to talk about next time we get together, Michael. Now, Michael's most recent book is Crazy, George Harriman in Black and White from Harper, and it is a fantastic book. Ben Schwartz writes, no time for a 2017 roundup, and he literally emailed me as I was turning the mic on. But the book I'm really looking forward to, which I just received for Hanukkah, is Paul Karasik and Mark Newgarden's How to Read Nancy. By taking one perfect Nancy comic strip by Ernie Bushmiller, the August 8, 1959 3-panel gag, the authors lay out the fundamentals of visual storytelling in comics. I've only flipped through it at this point, but it also includes a healthy selection of Bushmiller strips and a detailed breakdown of Bushmiller's art and career. Ben didn't offer up any 2017 suggestions, and, well, we didn't have time. You can find his Twitter feed, Ben Schwartzy, Schwartzy. He is not the same Ben Schwartz who played John Ralphio on Parks and Rec. Pete Bagge writes, favorite read of 2017? Old Hometown by Rose Wilder Lane, a collection of short stories Lane wrote for the Saturday Evening Post about her coming of age in thinly fictionalized Mansfield, Missouri in the early 1900s. I'm writing a comic biography on Lane, so I've read everything I could find by her these past 2 years, but this collection is the most impressive. Like her contemporary and another graphic novel subject of mine, Zora Neale Hurston, Lane seemed to be at her best when telling stories with an undeniable feminist theme. Why that is hard to explain, especially since neither woman was the least bit strident on the subject of feminism. But it's their experiences as, especially younger, women navigating their way through society's gender expectations that sure did fuel their fiction writing. For 2018, I need to catch up on my comic book reading. I have fallen way behind. I have no idea who or what my cartoonist peers are talking about half the time. Pete's most recent comic was Fire, his aforementioned biography of Zora Neale Hurston, from Drawn and Quarterly. Jeff Nunokawa writes, I loved reading Edward Mendelssohn's books on Auden, early Auden and late Auden, which are now in one volume. These excellent books draw on the life to light up the work. There are parts of Auden I've been wanting as a casual but loving reader to understand for years, or just pretended weren't there. What most people don't know who only know Auden a little, though, like me, they may love that little a lot, is how strange and difficult he is. I have found parts of Auden impenetrable. While respecting the mystery of the poetry, his life of the poet does a lot to light it up. I don't think it's going too far to put Mendelssohn up there with Samuel Johnson. Speaking of whom, I plan on reading Boswell's Life, which I haven't read since grad school. You should definitely check out Jeff Nunokawa's Facebook Notes offerings, these daily essays he does via Facebook, and the book that came out of that project, Notebook, from Princeton University Press. Kathy Bidus writes, I have to say, nothing I read this year really slayed me, but I'm really looking forward to Nell Scovell's new memoir in 2018, just the funny parts, and a few hard truths about sneaking into the Hollywood Boys Club. Kathy was a contributor to the cookbook/essay anthology Sister Writer Eaters from Griffith Moon Publishing. Last but not least, comics legend Howard Chaykin. Howard's been very busy since his home is in Ventura, California, and he had to evacuate because of the wildfires there. His home is unscathed, but obviously it's been pretty hectic. He says he and his wife are fine, but they just feel like they've taken up smoking again. Anyway, Howard didn't have time to put together a full Best of 2017 list or his hopes for 2018, but he sent over a list of all the books he's read and dug, well, the books he really loved, in the past 2 months, and it is mighty impressive. Kill All Normies by Angela Nagel, Warner Brothers, The Making of an American Movie Studio by David Thompson, Two Moons by Thomas Mallon, Friends and Traitors by John Lawton, The World of Tomorrow by Brendan Matthews, Manhattan Beach by Jennifer Egan, The Force by Don Winslow, Defectors by Joseph Kanan, and The Death of Expertise by Tom Nichols. Howard's most recent comic is Divided States of Hysteria from Image. Last and least, me. I did promise you some of my faves, so here goes. And if you want, you can always visit chimeraobscura.com/VM and check out the list of every book I have finished reading since 1989, because I'm that crazy. Turns out Walter Benjamin did the same thing, except he committed suicide while on the run from the Nazis, so he didn't keep a list anywhere near as long as mine. Now, according to my great spreadsheet that knows all, I read 51 books this year, not including comics. And only 2 of those were rereads. Hemingway's Sun Also Rises, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. Most everything else was related to the podcast, but I did do some extracurricular reading. Now, there's a big arching group of books I'm going to mention at the end, but before that, let me get to the most important thing I read this year, which was Survival in Auschwitz by Primo Levi. First time I'd read Levi. His depiction of Auschwitz is soul-shattering. It's an amazing, amazing book. If you haven't read it, you should. I'm embarrassed I hadn't read it until now. Bad Jew, that's on me. There's a chapter in there, I think it's chapter 11, about Dante and Ulysses. And Levi recounts how, as a prisoner in Auschwitz, he tried to recite lines from the Inferno, from those particular cantos, to a prisoner he was working with. It, again, is sort of soul-shattering. It's also what this podcast is all about in terms of trying to preserve culture. Not that our day-to-day life is like Auschwitz, but, that thing touched me the most of anything in that book. That sense of trying to get that humanity and that art and keep something alive in the middle of a world of no meaning. Obviously, no book is going to top that, but there are other ones that reverberated with me during the year. Stranger in a Strange Land, George Prochnik's book about Gershom Scholem. That one, it's hefty. It's, I think, really important. It's a great follow-up to George's book about Stefan Zweig, because Scholem forms a neat counter to Zweig's response to Hitler's rise. To Zweig, it was all about running as far as he could till he ended up in the forests of Brazil, where he and his wife killed themselves. To Scholem, it was all about going to Palestine and forming a new Jewish homeland. And George contrasts that with his own experiences of taking Aliyah or making Aliyah and going to Israel for a bunch of years. It's a really good book. Stranger in a Strange Land. That's from Other Press. I also finally started reading Joan Didion this year, but it was all stuff from like the 90s on, which makes me think I really have to go back to her early work, like Slouching Toward Bethlehem, especially after watching that documentary that Griffin Dunn made about her this year. I have this pipe dream hope that I can get her, but there are much more illustrious interviewers than I who can't get anywhere near Didion. So we'll see. Also in nonfiction, for sheer fun, nothing topped Eddy Portnoy's book, Bad Rabbi, which I mentioned in Eddy's segment earlier. That came from Stanford University Press. It's a bunch of stories of criminal Jews in the Yiddish press from Warsaw and New York throughout the turn of the century on. Loads of fun. Bad Rabbi. Give it a read. Now for fiction, Moving the Palace by Sharif Majdalani from New Vessel Press. Showed up out of the blue. reminded me of Calvino's Invisible Cities crossed with The Leopard by Lampedusa with a dash of Neil Gaiman's Sandman comics, like the ones that I liked. So that's just a winner. Short book, really just an amazing piece of work. I actually sent a copy of it to someone recently because I bought like 5 or 6 of them last time New Vessel was having a sale. Lovecraft Country by Matt Ruff, who you got to hear earlier this episode. Enjoy the living heck out of that one, but also can't wait to see it as an HBO series. Usually I'd have no interest in a book getting adapted to TV or movies. This one is written for that, not in a way that detracts from it as a novel, but I think it'll be a lot of fun. A weird one that I really enjoyed was Private Citizens by Tony Tulatamuti. I sort of feel like if Tom Wolfe was young, he'd write something like this. It's about 4 recent graduates from Stanford, middle of the previous decade, so like 04, 05, before the financial crash. It's just really entertaining. The characters' lives are neat. I really enjoyed it and was glad that I got turned on to that one. I also read all of Nathan Englander's work this fall and prepped for a I Hope It's Going to Happen podcast. And looking back on 2 short story collections and 2 novels, I think I enjoyed his first collection most. That's For the Relief of Unbearable Urges. It was kind of a fun Philip Roth, Bruce J. Friedman, but in the world of much more observant Jews than either of them ever wrote about. So I know it's harkening back 20 years, but For the Relief of Unbearable Urges was a pretty good collection. And that gets me to this big nexus of books that are continually warping my brain right now. There's an ecological vibe to all 3 authors and works, and they are sticking with me a lot. I'm going to walk you through those. The first was Jeff Vandermeer's Area X trilogy, also known as the Southern Reach books, Annihilation, Authority, and Acceptance. They're about this mysterious ecological environmental disaster in which a zone in northern Florida becomes cut off from human contact. There's this invisible barrier of sorts that separates that area from the rest of us with a single known entry point. The government establishes a base next to it, which is the Southern Reach. And for the next couple of decades, expeditions are sent in to explore it. Very few of them come back, and those who do are changed. The first book in the series is the journal of a member of the last expedition, while the second and third books are about the aftermath of that trip. In total, it's this amazing, amazing novel. Reminded me in parts of Solaris by Stanislaw Lem, which I love, in terms of the sheer alienness of this Area X and the shortcomings of human communication and intelligence and the weird doppelgangers that the zone creates, along with a lot of other elements. It's a really eerie series of books. And when I would go for walks with my dog while I was reading it, I would hear things differently. I live in the woods, basically, 25 miles from New York, but in a wooded area. And the birds sounded a lot different when I was in Area X, you know? After that, I read John Crowley's new novel, Caw, which a few of our guests talked about. That one, Liz Hand gives the longest description of it. It's told by a semi-immortal crow, and it explores themes about the afterlife and how people populate the world with stories. But it also has an ecological vibe in terms of how we're destroying the world around us. Like I said, narrated by a crow, Crowley does a great job of not just anthropomorphizing the animal's consciousness. Caw has an amazing scope, and I think it gave me more intimations of my mortality than anything else I read this year. And Crowley and I talk about that a little in terms of how he couldn't have written this book 20 years earlier. Now, the thing is, all of those set me up to have my brain flat out melted this fall by a book called The Peregrine by J.A. Baker. Matt Worker, our first guest on this week's episode, suggested that one when we were discussing midlife crises back in September when we recorded our session. It is one of the strangest, most beautiful books I have ever read, and I have no idea how to explain it. The Peregrine is nonfiction nature writing about the fall to spring stretch in eastern England in one year in the mid-60s. The book, it's just a chronicle of the writer's days of keeping an eye on a pair of peregrines. And that's it. We learn nothing about his life or his motivation, although his misanthropy suffuses the book. He is clearly happier being in a world without men. The thing is, this book is filled with some of the most amazing prose I've ever read. The author, he just turns these just astonishing phrases, bringing this inhuman majesty out of the tooth and claw lives of birds of prey. See, the thing is, throughout this, he's not trying to make the peregrine his familiar, but is trying to become the familiar of the peregrine, so that the bird recognizes him as not human. It's just breathtaking. Just all the mundane aspects of bird watching build into this pagan shift in consciousness. It'll stick with me a while. That feeling I said, like how Area X made me hear the birds differently, the Peregrine amplified that a million times in terms of all my senses and how I perceive the woods and nature around me. You'll learn to see things differently. And again, as one of the previous guests said, that's what books are all about. Of everything I read this year, I think that one really hit me the most. And I have not even thought about 2018 beyond the upcoming guest reading I have to do. Looking at my shelves now, I gotta work on early Joan Didion. I'd like to return to Plutarch. I know I have to read more Shakespeare. My thing is, I'm really trying to write more, and my hope is that I will be reading more things that I've written in 2018, and maybe you guys will too. But remember, in early January, I'll post my annual write-up, Another Year in the Books, over at the Virtual Memories blog, where I go over every book I read, again, prose, not comics, in the past year. That's at chimeraobscura.com/vm/blog. And that's it for the 2017 edition of the Guest List on the Virtual Memories Show. Our music for this episode is Nothing's Gonna Bring Me Down by David Bayerwald, used with permission from the artist. Thanks so much for listening to this special episode of the podcast. I'm taking next week off because it's right after Christmas, and none of you will be around to listen. But I will be back the first week of January with our 250th episode. You'll have to come back to find out who the special guest is, but I promise it's not me. Now, the Virtual Memories Show is all about keeping literary culture alive. And if you'd like to become a supporter of the podcast, visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and set up a recurring or one-time donation. That'll get you access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, as well as patron-only blog posts, some postcards of past guests, handwritten show notes for every episode, a series of ebooks, and this weird analog memories thing that I've just started contemplating. That's a weird project, but you'll find out more about it next year if I decide to pursue it. If you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, of course, or if you just want to toss me some money because you think the show is worth it and you're glad that I'm out here doing this, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to Kevin Keiler, John Wendler, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Stephen Nadler, Wallis Wilde-Menozzi, Noah Van Sciver, Andrew Mason, Greg Tanner, Garrett Zecker, Craig P. Steffen, Jack Les Camella, and Ron Slate for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store or at soundcloud.com/VMSpod. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, chimeraobscura.com/VM, or the much easier to remember vmspod.com. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, and at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com. Oh, and by going to YouTube and just searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and review for us. That'll help build a bigger audience. And really, going into 2018, if you dig this show, tell other people about it. I need more listeners. It's the only sense of self-worth that I really have. I'm just kidding. My self-worth comes out of these great conversations and book recommendations. But it would be great to see an uptick in listeners next year. So if you can influence people to listen to this podcast, go right ahead. You have my blessing. And if you have ideas for great guests for me, please let me know. Until next time, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way, and have a great 2018.